And so without further ado, let me introduce our first keynote speaker. So Mitchell Petersen is the Glen Vasel Professor of Finance at Kellogg School of Management, Northwestern University. His research interests are in empirical corporate finance. So in his own words, the questions of how firms evaluate potential investment projects and how they fund such projects. But that also includes how sort of information affects these dimensions. So he has published in all three top finance journals, and also in this other journal in Econ. His research has been cited over 27,000 times, according to Google Scholar, and yet, I dare say, his most important contribution is still ahead of him, and is here to tell you all about it. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mitchell Petersen. Drew has asked if you could microphone.
This doesn't work. You know, is it on now? 1, 2, okay. So, I mean, first of all, I just want to thank Michael and Bjorn and the entire organizing committee for putting this program together. Looking ahead, I'm really looking forward to it. Kind of my stage of career, you come here to learn opposed to teach. I also appreciate their lapse in judgment in letting me start. But they said we're going to start low and we're going to go high, which is how we sort of decided to organize the two keynotes. This talk is based in part on a review article that I have written with my colleague Jose Liberty, and it comes from actually quite a while ago, and it was my attempt to put a set of work together that I'd been working on as well as a number of other people. And it started back in 2004 when I was asked to give a talk at the AFA. So at the time I'd been working on banking, and they said there's this idea of soft and hard information just started to percolate, and they said, can you give a talk? And I wrote down, 5 or 6 slides, put together a bunch of bullet points, and I talked for about 20 minutes. Not terribly structured, certainly far from done, but it really intrigued me, and it went relatively well. So Wayne Passmore, who put the session together, called me afterwards and said, talk went well, can you send me the paper? I said, there is no paper. No, there has got to be a paper. We need to put in the conference volume. I said, you didn't ask me to write a paper. You asked me to give a talk. I gave a talk. I've got PowerPoints. I don't have a paper. He said, there's got to be a paper. I spent the weekend. I banged out about 20, 25 pages. Not my best work by far stretch, but it's going to be buried in a conference volume. Nobody really reads that conference volume. But just to be safe, I stuck it up on my webpage. And it was built on sort of this idea of there are different kinds of information. If you think about Mihail's introduction, the idea is how are these different kinds of information? We know finance is built on it. We know it's sort of hard to process, communicate, store, and technology changes it, but we really didn't have that idea. And Jeremy Stein's work on sort of passing information inside a firm, and actually if you go much further back to the scope of the firm, a lot of that stuff was there. For me, this came from my work on banking with Raghu. So we got involved in relationship banking, in part because I had data and he was a good theorist. So I had worked in college at the Small Business Administration, and I went there because they had a data on small business finance, or so they told me. When I showed up, they said, we'd like to collect a data set on small business finance. What do you think we should put in it? They asked someone who's going to be a senior in college. I thought, wow, these guys are out of their league. If they're asking me, we're in a lot of trouble. I get to graduate school, and they sent me the data set. And so that's kind of how we started. So my roadmap for that original talk, for the review paper, and for this paper is threefold. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this distinction between hard and soft information. And it's come to the literature to be in 2 boxes, but I want you to think of it as more of a continuum. And that's actually true of lots of things in finance. Debt and equity are not uniquely defined. They're really sort of endpoints on a continuum, and the same idea is here. I want to next explain why I think the distinction is useful, because defining something isn't valuable unless it means I change the way I think about it or I change the way we build securities and organizations. And that's kind of going to be my last piece. I want to sort of talk about what the implication is for research And some of that was in the fingerprints of the original paper, and some of these events happened afterwards, and I kind of wish I'd understood how they would play out. Now, when I say epiphany, I often get asked by junior faculty, now that I'm this stage of life, like, where do your research ideas come from? And I actually think that is a brilliant question, and I'm always terribly embarrassed by my answer, because most of my ideas like run into me on a quiet afternoon when I'm not paying attention. And this one is exactly the same thing. So I've got 2 sons. My youngest son is named Equity. He doesn't have problems, he has issues. Or actually, he's got an entire subscription. So he would go see a therapist once a week, and sometimes I would go, but as I'm trying to get tenure, sometimes I would send his nanny. And so we had bifurcated, and I had given her the right to collect information, and I had retained decision rights. Most nannies don't understand that distinction, but this one I think actually did. So I would tell her what to sort of look for and collect when she was there, but I realized I did a horrible job because the environment was complex, it was constantly changing, it was multidimensional, and I didn't know how to describe what to look for. Now, if I went there, I could kind of figure out this is important and why, but I had trouble encoding that. And I was trying to figure out how to sort of do what little personal life I have. I ran into this realization this is exactly the same issue I had when it came to soft and hard information. And so that's why I kind of want to start with a description of how we think about what the difference between soft and hard information is. Hard information can be reduced to a set of numbers or facts. They're easily communicated, and you completely understand what they do. In our work with lending, we sort of thought of it as a credit score, or a quantity of output, or actually a stock return is the number I like the best. If I tell you that Tesla's stock was up 4% today, everybody knows precisely what that means. Soft information isn't quite as easily reduced. It's perspective, it's opinion, it's views of things, but it tends to be communicated in text. Now notice, the ability to reduce it to a number, that can't in and of itself be what hard information is. Because all the information we have, from the numbers to the text to pictures, are going to be reduced to binary when we save them. So it's more that when we reduce them to those, you fully understand them, and that means that context is incredibly important. When I tell you the return on a stock is 4%, not only do you know the fact I'm telling you, but you fully understand the context. That was the problem I ran into in collecting the information. The context wasn't clear. This distinction is very similar to the way we teach first-year econometrics in Ph.D. classes versus the way most of us empirically do research. When you walk into that class and we teach regression, we know what the independent variable is, we know what the dependent variable is, we know what the functional form is, and the only thing we are uncertain on is precisely what beta is. I've never seen a research proposal where they knew all that information. I've got an idea of the idea I want on the left, but I don't know how to measure it. I've got this laundry list of concepts on the right, but I don't know how to measure it, and believe me, functional form, I don't have an idea. And that's kind of what we mean by the difference between soft and hard information. As I said, this, from my view, comes from the lending literature. And so at the time when we talked about lending, Raghu and I focused on relationships. So we looked at the building on the left, and these things have been around for hundreds of years, are incredibly persistent. Most of us probably haven't been in one in 4 or 5 years. Used to be you would go into one of these buildings and you meet a loan officer, a well-compensated individual whose time was very valuable. And you would spend 45 minutes to an hour discussing whether you get a loan. They would collect a lot of numeric stuff, but a lot of it was your personality. Did you look them in the eye? The firmness of your handshake? They knew your family. They were on the PTA with you. Your kids played in similar types of sports. The one on the right, which literally did not exist when we started doing this, is a different version. And that's the one where I think is much more hard information. Now, if you're going to make a loan decision in 30 seconds, there clearly can't be any real-time human interaction. And so what that means is we need to fully understand the context before we get there. And so that distinction of can I capture everything or not, that context independent. With that mortgage application, they know exactly what they're going to collect, they know the ranges they're going to collect, and they know how that's going to be mapped into a decision before you walk in. Although the knowledge in the head of the loan officer is there, it's not clear that they know exactly what to ask, and it's a little bit like a job interview. When you ask a question and you get an answer, then you look at the next thing that you're going to ask and then the next thing after that. And so what I want to do is think about this separation of the data collection and the decision making. With the loan officer, those all are in the single individual, and so you don't need to worry about what loss of information happens. The context is all there because I collected all the information, but I also understand it. Once we move this to the hard information, we separate those apart, well then the person collecting the information no longer makes the decision, they got to pass all that along. It also means that they now have potentially different incentives. How do you compensate that individual that collects the information but does not make the decision? And that's going to affect sort of what information they want to collect. Not just what they can, but their incentives in terms of what information they want to collect. And that's something I want to come back to later as we talk about some of the work. Okay, what are the advantages or disadvantages of the different ones? Well, one of the beauties of going to that online app, one of the beauties of hard information is you now get to automate this decision. So replacing an expensive loan officer with a relatively cheap clerk. And it used to be that's what you would do. You would go into the bank and you would fill out the information. Now they were making sure you knew how to fill it out and had the right information, but there were no decision. Expensive labor gets replaced by cheap labor. Cheap labor gets replaced by really, really cheap capital. And that's essentially what's happened when we've moved to an app. If you're going to do that, that means you need to standardize the data. You need to standardize the data collection. Because the variables I'm going to collect and the format in which I collect them is now always going to be the same. That's going to drop my cost. Once I build up that system, whether I run 10 applications or 10 million applications through it, it's the same cost. So the marginal cost of collection and the standardization have made this much cheaper. It also changes the geography. So if you physically have to go into the building and talk to the individual to collect the information, then the borrower and the lending officer or whoever is providing the information collecting it needs to be geographically close. Once we switch to hard information, that's going to increase the geographic fit. And that's why these economies of scale and economies of scope have caused much more concentration in these industries because a few big players can basically take over. As they do, costs tend to drop. As the costs tend to drop, well, that's going to create pressure to be more competitive, and that more competition is also going to tend to drive the incentive for dropping those costs even further. There's another dimension here. Soft information, because it's in the head of the loan officer, whoever collected, they control that. The minute it's hard information and is context independent and is easy to transmit, then the ability to capture those rents become much more difficult. That's also going to increase the competition, and we're going to see some fingerprints of that in the way we have changed these institutions over time. Greater durability of information. If the information is in the head of the loan officer, when they retire, all of that information goes away. And the beauty of converting to hard information isn't just you can pass it from one person to another at the same time, but you can pass it to one person at the time in the future. And that becomes much more durable. This reminded me of the description Crane and Eccles have of investment banking. Now, as they write the book, they want to describe the investment banking industry, but by the time they publish it, it is somewhere between the history and ancient history of investment banking. And they describe how, as a young graduate, Mihail graduates from business school, and he goes off to be a junior PM at an investment bank. I graduate from a lesser business school and go work at an operating non-financial as a junior peon. And over the next 25 or 30 years, he will rise to be the senior partner, I will rise to be the CFO, and we have worked together for 25 or 30 years, and that relationship we've developed is not just the information at the time, but the context over time. By the time they write this book, turnover in the financial professions have increased dramatically. I don't know which way causation goes. If you have more turnover, then you need to be able to maintain that information, so there's going to be huge pressure to convert it to hard information. However, once you convert it to hard information, you do not need to keep those people around, and so you're going to have both of these are affecting. Now, everything I'm going to tend to do in this paper tends to be about finance, but the more I think about this, you're going to see evidence of this outside the field of finance. And so one of the beauties of the way Michael described this is information isn't just about finance. In fact, just not about economics, but lots of other fields. And so what'll be curious is how the ideas from our papers that are targeted toward financial institutions and markets are going to bleed out into other ones. Disconnection of time and place I talked about. And so all of a sudden, now we have a much more geographic reach. We have a much bigger reach in terms of time. Lost information. See, there are two basic ways of making these loans as we described. One is that automated way where I'm going to convert everything to a credit score. So I figure out what variables are relevant, what ranges are relevant, and everything I throw away. And now I've got a binary decision. You make the loan or not. You build the project or you don't. The soft information is the same thing. It comes out with a single binary decision, so at the end it's the same. Now, as long as that binary decision is at the end of the chain of actions, it doesn't matter. If you think about Ivo Welsh's work on cascades, that's an exception, but it's an exception that I'm going to tend to ignore. The challenge is, where is that information lost? Well, as long as maintaining the information, storing the information, transmitting the information is completely free, you never want to throw away the information. Clearly that isn't true, although the cost of saving that has fallen over time. And so the challenge we have is between the cost of the lost information versus it's much cheaper and it's much more doable. Friedman, in his book Free to Choose in 1990, said this was one of the advantages of a market economy. So if you grow oranges and you see the price of oranges rise, you don't know if there's been an increase in demand or a decrease in supply of your competitors, but you really don't need to know anything else. And so condensing it to that single variable makes it much more efficient. And that's the research question for us. How much of this information, this loss, is relevant? And so when you boil it down in these ways, part of the problems we're going to run into, and we're going to talk about a couple of them near the end of the talk, is that lost information. Ex post, I'm really good at figuring this out. Ex ante, not so much. Okay, those I basically had in the first versions. The next two I kind of missed. And one of my co-authors, Falconer, says, I have a very rosy view of humanity, and I kind of assume people do the right thing. He has a very dark sense of humanity, and so we make a kind of good combination. Everything I've done so far has talked about the information collector, and they're going to collect the information, and they're going to make the decision. But the target of the decision, the borrower in my example, is also important. And up until this point, I really didn't think about what they were doing. Now, if they have a chance to figure out how to change that information and they can manipulate or alter it, that's going to be an issue. See, with the soft information, when the loan officer interviews you for that hour and a half, clearly you want to communicate that you're honest, but like what variable changes it? It's also the case that probably moving up a little bit your honesty score doesn't matter because these decision rules aren't as discrete, or at least they're fuzzy, and I don't know where the discreteness comes from. That's why I like the example of the credit ratings. So if you think about what a credit rating is, it's essentially trying to take all that numeric data, but they also have a lot of qualitative data because they're industry experts, and reduce it down to a credit rating. And once I have that credit rating, I'm going to figure out what that is. Now, the challenge is the corporations have some capacity to move those numbers and variables. As long as it is fuzzy, that's not an issue. During the financial crisis, the number of defaults of investment-grade debt spiked. And so academics and practitioners and governments had to step in and figure out what is the problem. And there's actually a very obvious problem: incentives. Corporations paid rating agencies to give them grades. Can you imagine setting up an institution where the individuals that came to that institution, let's call them students, pay the institution money, and then the employees of the institution will give grades back? Obviously, the incentive problem is horrible, and that would never work. You catch on this much faster. Every time I do this with like industry or regulator, it takes a lot longer. It's like, wait a minute, that's what you do. It's like, exactly. I haven't questioned my grading yet. Now, one of the interesting facts, however, if you look at where those spikes in defaults were, they weren't uniform. So investment grade debt of operating companies did spike, but the level of default, given the severity of the recession, was actually lower than the previous recession. So most of the abnormal defaults happened in the securitized market. Why is that? It can't just be paying for ratings. Well, if you're an operating company and you go talk to a Moody's or an S&P and you get a BBB rating and you want something higher, they might say, sell off your European division, close these production lines, and I'm going to move it. Operating companies have lots of competitive advantage. Lower capital is one of them, but it's not the biggest one, and one rating notch just doesn't move it that much. So the cost relative to benefits isn't worth it. If I look at a securitization that literally is no operations, their essentially only competitive advantage is that cost of capital. And so if they can slightly move one of the variables, how geographically diverse are the mortgages? What are the diversification across the supply chain, and get that to move? Now, as long as those are opaque, as long as those are fuzzy, there's not a lot of incentive to move it a little. The minute they become discrete, that's where this is going to be an issue. And I want to come back to that a little bit later in the talk. Sixth sort of advantage or disadvantage is the role of discretion. So in that app, you put in the numbers and it is going to make a decision. So there is no human discretion in this. Discretion may be really helpful. So part of the reason we argued in our early work on relationship lending was an advantage is that relationship allowed you to collect information that was not otherwise visible. If you talk to them once, you don't know nearly as much as if you built a relationship over 10 years, and you get an idea that when things are tough, how honest are they? When things are difficult, how they respond under stress. So one of the beauties of this is not only do you collect more information in the relationship, but it allows you to use discretion in the way you do it. It also may build up a sense of reciprocity. And this is coming more from the sociology lecture. If I have borrowed from you for 15 years and times are tough, it's much harder maybe for me to default on that loan opposed to a default to a faceless, nameless financial institution. And some of Professor Sapienza's work on the financial crisis, if the mortgage had been sold, they're more likely defaulted. Okay, that's the good part. The bad part is that discretion also may allow you to put a thumb on the scale. So we've been working with you for a long time. We've become friends. I know this tough time. I've got to help you out. Financially, it's a bad decision, but emotionally, personally, it's a good one. And so as a result, I'm going to make the loan where I otherwise wouldn't. And so that discretion provides information. It provides change in incentives, but it also is going to distort the incentives in some cases. And that's the trade-off that the shareholders have when they oversee the loan officer. It is cheaper, it is more durable, I lose information, but I may also have a discretion. That's the beauty of going to a hard information model where you put the numbers in and that model makes the decision and there is no discretion. These things are never as simple as I thought. And so there is this beautiful paper by Berg and co-authors where they look at a bank that did exactly that. They build a credit reporting system, and the loan officer puts in all the variables, and then the system kicks out an answer. And it takes these loan officers several months to figure out where those cutoffs are, even though they aren't reported. He is honest on a scale of 1 to 7, 3, no. 3.5, no. 4, no. 4.5, yes. He's a 4.5. And so they basically reverse engineer the model because they're allowed multiple bites at the apple. And so as much as we'd like to think that hard information takes away that discretion, not so much. Up until this point, I've really talked about hard and soft information as inherent characteristics of the underlying data. The return on a stock is hard information. A consideration of whether Petersen asks soft information. But is information type immutable? Can you really make soft information harder? So I want to go back and talk about two historical examples that I like immensely, where they tried to take what I would call soft information and convert it into a much more hardened form. The first is the rise of the credit reporting agencies in the US. So the precursor to what will later become Moody starts in about 1840. The precursor to what will later become S&P starts in about 1860. And what drives this is technological shocks, transportation and communication. That's why I think this conference is so prescient and the timing is so beautiful, because there's so much data out there. Our ability to transform it is technologically driven, and technology seems to move much faster than our ability to understand it. So, you are a merchant in Boston. All of the people you buy from are in Boston, and all the people you sell to are in Boston. Since the banking system isn't fully developed, trade credit's a very important source of capital, but you need to figure out the people you extend receivables to, how good a credit quality are. They're down the street. You've dealt with them for 30 years. You know their kids, their spouse, or whatever. All of a sudden, with the railroad and the telegraph, you can now sell to people in Cleveland or DC who you have never met. And so the challenge was, how do you figure out whether they're good? So these early credit reporting agencies would recruit individuals in all the cities. They would find bankers or business people or lawyers that would write these books on all the credits. Mr. Petersen is a responsible, honest young man. Respects his wife, beats his children the appropriate amounts, goes to church, and pays his bills on time. And if you go read them, they're hysterically detailed. They're not exactly what you think of as a credit score today, but less so. And by doing this, what they were allowing to do is all of a sudden create credit scores. They created a pecuniary strength, which was basically net worth, and a general credit quality that boiled everything down. And so you would subscribe to these services, and you could look up somebody in the books, and it would tell what their rating was, so you could lend to them. Or if you subscribed and went into their office, it costs more and you physically had to go there, you would read the report. See, the beauty of that hard score is it was very cheap and efficient to transmit it a long way, but once one of us looked up this number, I can share it with my friends. So capturing that financially was very hard. We wanted all that soft information, much less easy to do, and in the days before copy machines, literally impossible to do. The other one, and one that has transformed our profession, is the Center for Research and Security Prices. And if you think what is done to the asset pricing literature, and frankly, S&P's Compustat on the corporate side, at least for my life, that was the two data sets we used. Unfortunately, those of you growing up now need to learn 75 different data sets. I had to master at most 2. I don't know if you know the history of CRISP, but it's absolutely fascinating. There's a guy named Engel who's a VP at Merrill Lynch Pierce Fenner. He shows up at the University of Chicago and says, I want to find the most knowledgeable, the most senior, the wisest finance professor. We have a really big finance question. And so they bring out this guy, Professor Jim Lorry, who at the time was the chair of the department. And they asked Professor Lorry, if you were to invest in stocks for a long time, what is the average return on equities? Now, the first thing that is terrifying of this question is someone who has been in the profession of finance for 25, 30 years, works at one of the premier banks, advises people with lots of money, doesn't know. So Professor Lorry, who is awesome, says that is an excellent question. I don't know. Okay, the second problem with this theory is someone who is teaching these people doesn't know. But he's very fast on his feet. He says, for $25,000, I'll figure it out. Turns out it's a $50,000 grant, and that's how we get CRISP. I think these examples are useful because as we think about the institutions we are talking about and explaining, they didn't start 10 years ago. They started 25, 30, 100 years ago. As we talk to the students in our classroom, they've lived in a world where it is inconceivable that you can't pull up the return on an asset for the last 30 years on your phone. But literally, no one did. Now, as this quote at the first conference 2 years later says, most finance research has been done by people that know the markets very well and don't know any statistics. They haven't found out much. We're now going to replace it with people that know statistics but don't necessarily know a lot about finance. That's also a sterile environment that won't work. And if I read the literature today, you see we've done the two together, where we've now got all the statistics, but we've also started to trace back. But take a minute to think about this research and the slide that Michal put up originally and what we're going to see later on text processing. During my early career, almost all the corporate finance papers, if you looked at the 150 pages of an annual report or a 10K, we used somewhere between 3 to 6 pages. We used the income statement, we used the balance sheet, we used the cash flow statement, and all the other stuff didn't because there was no way to convert words into text. And then all of a sudden, we found the ways to do it, and that's part of what we're going to see later this afternoon. Okay. applications of information type to our profession and research. And the first two, as you can tell, they've got a much longer history. And those, although there's been a lot of research since the first version of the paper, at least parts of it was there. The second, third, and fourth, not only did I not see them coming, but there are a lot of the issues that I wished I'd been thinking harder about this at the time, because a lot of what we saw in those historical examples, you're going to see in the financial crisis. The first one is going to be distance. And this is kind of where we started with it. The papers that we wrote, relationships, one of the variables that they had in it was this question of, for a small business, think about the bank branch you use the most often. How physically far away is that? And I saw that data. And I called up Raghu and I said, this has got to be our next paper. This is going to be a pretty easy paper. If it works, it'll be a single. When you're young and nobody knows you, you borrow from mom and dad. You borrow across the street. And as you get bigger and more well-known and more established, your circle of borrowing tends to expand. So we are going to figure out that when you're young, you borrow really close, and when you're much older, you borrow further away. Gary Gorton discussed this paper, and he said, I don't know if this is the way things change over your career or the world has changed on me. Because early in my career, he said, I would always co-author with people down the hall. Now I co-author with people across the country or across the world, and maybe it's that same expanse. So this part resonated with me. Raghu said we can do a small model. He's always the theorist because I can't write models. If he teaches me enough, I can explain them, sort of. So I run the regressions, and sure enough, young firms borrow very far away, and old firms borrow really close. So I send the results off to Raghu, and remember, he's supposed to be the theorist, and I'm supposed to be the empirical guy, and I love Raghu, and he goes, clearly, you don't know how to program. You made a numerical error, you made a mathematical error, go clean up your mistakes, and when you're done, come back and we will talk. Exactly the reaffirming response I was hoping from co-author. So, I spent 2, 3, 4 weeks debugging programs, looked at it. It was unbelievably robust. I could not get it to go away. Here's why I tell Ph.D. students, when you run into a brick wall, before you give up, if it's really a robust result, and it's hardwired into the coding in an uninteresting way, or it's hardwired into the data in an interesting way, finally hit us, and it took both of us bouncing back and forth. We had a point in time. So that means that a 3-year-old firm started borrowing in 1990. And a 13-year-old firm started borrowing in 1980, sorry, Freudian slip. And a 23-year-old firm started borrowing in 1970. And so once we broke that into how old when you were started and the chronological year you started borrowing, that's when it was clear. Age, turns out, didn't matter much at all, but that time you started mattered a lot. What we found is over a 2-decade period, the distance between firms and their borrowers increased about 3.5% per year after you controlled for everything you could think of. Size of the firm, age, industry, structure, profits, all sorts of stuff. You couldn't get it to go away, so we had a fact. Now, at the time, technology was increasing, and so what we did is we noticed that in areas where banks were automating their business early, where they were making more loans per employees, so hard information opposed to soft information, that's where this increase happened early. The technology we're talking about isn't very advanced, and so now if you think back to that picture from 10 minutes ago of that app, that's exactly the idea. Distance doesn't matter if I can boil the information down into hard information that fully captures it, that's context independent. And even after we do that, the small business, although distance increased a lot, it was relatively close. Well, that means as we look across different markets, distance is going to have a very different reaction. Small business lending, incredibly opaque, not much numbers, not much hard information. That's going to tend to have to be close. Public debt, for which there's lots of information, not very informationally sensitive, should be a national market. Same thing for public equities. And in the last decade or so, although that's generally true, there are a bunch of papers that found that doesn't quite capture it. There's this lovely paper by Koval and Moskowitz that looks at mutual fund holdings, and what they find is mutual funds tend to like to buy stocks that are close to them. They tend to seem to have maybe a performance, outperformance, that's a little fuzzy, but they tend to do it in the smallest firms, the most opaque firms, the most industry concentrated, which is exactly where you expect. Public bonds, corporate, that's one. Municipal bonds, there's a huge number. It depends on the local environment, the political environment. 80% of that underwriting is done by local underwriters. They tend to sell them at higher prices, lower yields. The only part I've never figured out of that paper is they don't charge higher fees. If you have a competitive advantage from being local, that seems like you should be able to do it. Real estate, they never talk about soft versus hard information, but clearly it is that local information. And then the way Josh Lerner describes sort of venture capital, that's like small banks on steroids. These are firms that do not exist in industries that do not exist. And that's why you see most of venture capitalists, especially the ones that are successful, are geographically very close. They tend to go visit the firms all the time. They want to be at the board meetings, but more importantly, they want to be there between the board meetings. That means as I look across assets and I look across types of investments, that distance and soft and hard information probably should be correlated, and to a first pass, it seems to be. Okay, that's physical distance. There's a set of papers, this beautiful one by Landier, that looks at internal investments. And what they find is the further from headquarters you are, your division tends to get less investments. You're more likely to lay off your workers, and you're more likely to divest it. And they classify firms that have more soft dependent versus hard. Opaque and transparent would be the same, and that effect is much stronger. Now, clearly, location is endogenous. So in his job market paper, Gerard does a nice job of coming back and looking at changes in distance. Not physical distance, but time of getting there based on airlines. And he finds essentially the similar idea. I got it, but thank you. Okay. Information type is going to tend to make organizational design. And that's a little bit what we just talked about with that Landier paper. So one of the sort of early efforts to this, and before we had soft and hard information, is what does it mean to have ownership? And the Grossman, Hart, and Moore papers look at ownership is the right to control who gets to use the asset and how they use it. So if it's my machine and I fire the workers, I keep the machine and I get to liquidate it or hire new workers or move it somewhere else. That's what it means to own the asset. And that worked beautifully when assets were tangible. What happens when assets are intangible, specifically information? Well, I own the information. When I fire my employees and they leave, I get to keep, except I don't. Because if the information is in the head of my programmer or my scientist or my loan officer, all of a sudden it tends to go with it. And so there's a set of, as I would call, first-generation papers that look at how the kind of information, soft and hard, the size of the firm, although most of the firms we looked at were small, and the size of the banks. And what we realize is, yes, large banks tend to lend to large firms. This isn't a portfolio issue because the firms we're talking about are incredibly tiny. But more importantly, the large banks tend to use hard information and the small banks tend to use the soft information. If you're a franchise, that's hard information. If you have audited records, that's hard information. Remember, these are small businesses, so the stuff you think is obvious, not all of them have. This was building on Jeremy Stein's theoretical work, which is why he is on this paper. If hard information is easy to pass up, because above me, my boss understands not just the data I gave him, but the context, then he can make the same decision I can. If soft information, we lose information, it can't be passed up. So that means that the only way we're going to be able to do this is if we think we can pass that information along. So the size of the bank is going to drive what information they're going to be able to use. But it also creates incentives. If I'm that loan officer and I know that above me they're going to make a decision whether to approve the loan or not, and I collect soft information which will not affect the decision, I get no credit for it. If I collect hard information, I will. And so that means the larger institutions, not just they can't use the hard information, but the endogenously will set up incentives not to collect the soft. So what we discovered during this period, there was a lot of bank consolidation. And so as banks got larger, that should create problems for those small banks or small firms that depend on the soft information. If you look at the OLS results, you see no effect. If you look at the IV, you do. Because what happened is if you were forced to borrow from a bank larger, it created a capital constraint. But during the sample period we examined, there was a massive entry of banks. And so there was consolidation. Two banks would merge. The old loan officers in the old bank would go open up a new one to fill in that unsatisfied clientele. Later, Alan's going to come back with Bowman and Kim and find the opposite result, which again I think is an important lesson. The fact that this didn't affect the access to capital is very dependent on the environment of the time. There was lots of entry. Starting about 2000, you see very little entry. Okay, that's the first generation because it says information type and the organizational structure don't always go together, but it doesn't really tell you what the mechanism is. It is a correlation, not causation. So Jose's job market paper and the next two look inside the firm. And one of the things Jose does is he finds a bank where they start to delegate authority down to lower levels. And what you see is they tend to collect more soft information, it has a much higher predictive power, and the fraction coming from the hard information declines. So that means it's not just that there's this correlation, but I need to think about how to sort of pass that information along. Okay. Okay, financial crisis. This is going to be number 3. So when we did the first one, we didn't really think about it, and credit ratings had become more common, and all of a sudden you also had securitization of the mortgage market. Now, given what I said on hard information, it seems obvious that this is going to be unambiguously good. If you have to talk to the local loan officer, then the bank is going to make loans only geographically close, and those are going to be really expensive. If you can convert this to more of a credit scoring type market, it will become much cheaper. You're going to have much more national sort of lenders, and you're going to allow much greater geographic diversification. So all the things we talked about early, those are going to be the benefits, and part of what allowed us to scale this information. The problem is a couple-fold. One is all of that soft information we had, that is going to be lost. Because if you are going to sell off these loans, you can't do it. Not just you can't pass the information along, but it's going to mess up the market. If you, the buyer of the mortgage portfolios, know less than I do the issuer, we know that creates a lemons problem from Stiglitz. And so the way we solve that problem is when I make the loan, I only look at hard information. If you and I have a discussion, that's going to be a problem. If I collect a bunch of variables and I know nothing else, that's going to be a much easier way to pass it on. Models didn't work as well as we expected, as we know. Now, part of the problem is the models had short history, and this is at least the second or third time we did it. You go back 15 years earlier, they started to do credit scoring on small business loans. They did it in a time period where everything was really good, and then the first recession came along, and the models fell apart. So this is a problem of short history, or it's much more endogenous. See, part of the problem we have is when you make these models have discrete changes, as we said, that are dependent on the borrower, there's an incentive to start changing this. And in this great set of papers, they basically look at what happens as securitization becomes larger. The predictive power of the models tend to collapse, and models estimated when securitization was low break down when securitization is high. That's that discrete cutoff. See, it used to be that if I went and paid off my credit cards, I got a little bit better. Maybe I was a little more likely to get the loan, maybe I paid a little bit less, but it didn't really have an effect. However, if you have a cutoff that unless you have a loan-to-value ratio of less than 80%, you don't get the mortgage. Unless you have a FICO score of 615 or more, you don't get the mortgage. Well, now, anybody with a 614 has a huge incentive, as we know, to go to 618. And so Keyes and group have this awesome paper that when securitization was low in an era where the no-doc loans, you don't see much of a jump at that point. At the other one, you do. Now, again, this is why it's important for us to explain to the world our lives. When we distribute grades at the end of the quarter, We have all learned after the second year of teaching, you never say the cutoff between an A and a B is 550 points. Because every 549, 548, 547, really optimistic, 532 is going to be in your office for arguing. So you say, well, it was somewhere in the 500s. Same idea is going to be true here. So this comes back to how you design this. Now, if you look at the way we do credit ratings, if you were to run a regression of credit ratings on all the accounting stuff, you get a very low R-squared. So that means there's a bunch of stuff in that rating that the model isn't there. Maybe we don't have all the variables, but you can throw the kitchen sink at it, it doesn't get better. Maybe we don't have the functional form, but you can throw the kitchen sink at it, it doesn't get better. Part of what's happening is they have other soft information because they ask you about industries. One of the unique things about the credit reporting agency is they get to ask and sometimes are given material non-public information. General Motors goes and asks Moody's for a rating. Moody's asks General Motors for their production plans for the next 5 years. General Motors explains that's private, confidential information we're not telling you. Moody's says, fine, we'll rate it without it. It's your call. And GM provides the information. But there's more than that. It's also that they are very unclear what those cutoffs are. So if they ever said you need interest coverage about a certain amount, you needed debt to asset below a certain amount, you'd have the same thing. So here's an example where an opaque model is a feature, not a bug. We sometimes argue that more transparency is better, more information is better, and this seems to be an example. The last topic that I want to talk about is fintech or new markets. Now, I don't know about you, but I have a large number of students cruising to my office who are very interested in fintech. They're going to go get a job in fintech. I ask them what fintech is, and they always know it's when technology solves all problems. I love the optimism of youth. So, as I look at these, what I really think fintech is solving old problems with new technology, trying to avoid the problems we've made before. And most of these business models, whether they be lending or asset pricing or insurance or real estate, usually are trying to convert soft information to hard information. Think back to the credit cards and the home mortgage. So in the US, credit cards start in basically the 1970s. And before credit cards, there was this concept of a signature loan. If you were wealthy enough and you had a good enough relationship with your banker, you would walk into the bank and say, I would like $50,000. You would sign your name and you would walk out with $50,000. I mean, if you guys had that. Me, that would never happen. And all of a sudden, they want to have credit cards. Allows you to go to a country you've never been in, walk into a restaurant you've never been in, consume the meal, it is now not repossessable, sign your name on a piece of paper and walk out. Think about the describing it like we all do it. Back in the mid-70s, the way they used to do this is it was through the phone system. So if you walked into a restaurant and you ordered a meal and you used a credit card, the restaurant would call their bank would call your bank would have some peon run down to the basement and look up your files and okay it. And needless to say, that was unbelievably costly. With time zones, your bank might be closed. And if they were, the restaurant had to decide whether to take the risk or not. And that's where the computer system comes in. Now this is all about credit scores. So that loan, signature loan, used to be, I knew you were a good credit risk. It's all those numbers that now come in. So, what are these models we're talking about? And I want to briefly go through three. I've read a lot of the literature, but when I got the program list, I discovered there are a bunch of papers I have not yet read, so I have a project for the next month. As I said, they're the kinds of areas where we have worked for years. Lending, raising equity capital, and asset allocation. They're trying to convert hard to soft information. And there's two nice papers that get very different results. So Ravinia goes and looks at data from Prosper.com and tries to predict the rate at which you're going to pay and whether you're going to get a loan with all the typical credit quality stuff, but she also throws in whether you are attractive. Now, she had a bunch of people evaluate this. Turns out attractive people are more likely to get loans. Attractive people pay less interest. Attractive people default at the same rate that I do, so that's an issue. Now, that doesn't sound like smart use of soft information. It sounds like unprofessional lenders, and most of the lenders at this point in time are retail. Peer and company get the opposite result. What they find is if you look at the interest rate charged by these lenders, it has more information than the credit score in terms of the default. Now, what do they have that we don't? Because remember, this is all interfaced through the computer. This is no relationship. It's stranger lending to stranger. Well, they have your picture, and they have a description. So somehow they're extracting information from your picture and your description on what kind of credit risk you are. Now, I would argue that even at this point, these are now historic artifacts because over 80% of the lenders at this point are professional institutions that are no longer the retail. But let's say that second fact is still true. If you have a really attractive picture and you have a very compelling story, you're more likely to get the loan and you're going to pay a lower interest rate. I've got Photoshop. So like the more attractive picture, I'm pretty sure I can do that. If I can drop the interest rate by cribbing off somebody else's description, I'm going to do it. Anytime there are transparent models based on inputs we can change, they're easily manipulable. So the question of how this market evolves is whether we can alter that. Crowdfunding. I've noticed that as many papers in this area are published in marketing as they are in finance should be a huge warning to us. Very little of the capital is raised for what you and I would call equity stake in the firm. Most of it is for a product to be named later, so think of this as market research. But again, if this was really sort of the kind of convert soft to hard information, what kind of information you have? This is like venture capital. These are firms that do not exist, often in industries do not exist, that are incredibly opaque. Now, one solution to that is the efficient markets. I'm not an expert on finance. I spend a lot of time teaching finance, but my former students spend hours more examining stocks than I do, so I'm pretty sure a contest between them picking stocks and me, I will always lose. But if I just buy everything, I will be okay. That works with public markets. The argument for private markets, I think, is much weaker. To be public, someone smart had to take you public. To be public, not only can people buy, but they can sell. So there's a finite number of stocks in the public market. In the private market, there's an infinite one. So I am very negative about this possibility. I reserve the right to be wrong, but unless they figure this out, less so. Robo-advising is, again, one where it clearly caters back to the advantages. If you're incredibly wealthy, you can pay someone a lot of money to be your private wealth manager. If you have $50,000, the economics just don't matter. But if I could automate what the choices are, I could automate collecting sort of what you have, all of that stuff tends to be hard information. It's a way to do it. The problem is part of the investment decision isn't just the assets you buy, it's also your risk tolerance, the biases you bring, your patience, how you react after an 87 crash. That part also needs to be collected. And so that relationship is partially about collecting that other information. It's probably also overwhelming some of those behavioral biases where you panic and want to sell, and they don't necessarily do it. The beauty is it can get rid of a bunch of our embedded biases. And Brian Melzer and co-authors have this wonderful paper that looks at the advice given to investors by their advisors. They tend to recommend avoid index funds. They tend to put them into funds that trade a lot. They tend to put them in funds that are really expensive. They do everything we tell them they shouldn't do. Now, clearly it's an incentive problem. They have an incentive to put you in expensive funds where they make more. This is what I like about the results. Go look at what their brokers do with their own money, and they make the same mistakes for them that they make for you. But then ask yourself, what kinds of people are really interested in finance? Some choose to be finance professors. Some choose to be private wealth managers. If you think you can beat the market, you probably don't choose finance professor. If you think that's impossible, you probably don't choose wealth manager. The beauty of these models is they can segregate those out. Again, that's not obvious. And we haven't seen as much in finance, but there's a book called Weapons of Math Destruction written by a data scientist that looks a lot of other ones. And since a lot of our machine learning, these models come from the data, any biases that we have embedded in the data get embedded in this other one. So I don't know where these three are going to be. I'm going to try to pay much closer attention than I did during the financial crisis, because I think the fingerprints of soft and hard information might be here, but I also fear I'll make the same mistakes. For the last couple of minutes, I want to talk about a topic that we never talk about at conferences. Many of us work at universities, and our job is knowledge creation and knowledge dissemination. So we spent the last 6 months to a year and a half creating knowledge, or in the case of the discussants, 2 months, because you all spent 2 months on the discussant. And here we are to disseminate it. However, research as a rule doesn't pay the bills. And so we also teach students who pay us to teach. And sometimes that is knowledge creation, but it is also knowledge dissemination. To what extent are the topics we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes, does that have implications for the classroom environment? So this is a 14th century illumination of a classroom. Peter Norberg taught one of the first MOOCs back in 2011 on artificial intelligence. And then he gave a TED talk on what he learned from it. And when he put this up, he said, until recently, you haven't seen much change in the classroom. You have the stage on the stage reading from the book. Well, now we got an iPad, but other than that, the same. I got all the students taking notes. They're a little bit better dressed than my students. And this one I love. You have a guy in the back room sleeping. So my classroom hasn't changed a whole lot until MOOCs come along. And all of a sudden, presidents of universities and deans are terrified that we're going to be wiped out because that best teacher of Finance 101 is going to teach everyone. It hasn't quite played out the way we've expected. Now, I want you to think about that question through the guise of hard and soft information, the guise of the way we teach econometrics versus the way we do econometrics. Some of what we teach in finance, especially basic finance, has the feel of hard information. How do you discount 110 at 10%? How do you amortize a loan? How do you run a CAPM regression? There's literally one answer because the context is completely clear. And we teach this stuff, and it's important, but it's not the most important piece. A lot of what we teach is the theory, and the intuition, and the logic, and the perspective. And part of this can be automated, and part of it can't. In the financial realm, the stuff that depends on hard information has tended to be automated. And the stuff that depends on soft information is not. So the question that I'm asking is, in teaching, do you expect to see the same way? I think it preserves our jobs. I think it makes it a whole lot more interesting. I hate dividing by 1 plus R. I like everything else. Thank you very much. I think we've got 5 minutes. I don't know how you want to use that.
Yes, indeed. So that's all for us to cover. For an excellent lecture. Indeed, we have a few minutes for questions. So if you would like to ask a question, raise your hand and need a microphone. I can hand it over to you. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. A lot of the things you're saying could be replaced with missing relevant control variables or irrelevant, or we don't want those control variables out there. Would you, so is there anything that this other interpretation is missing in this difference between hard and soft information?
So maybe. So when you say missing, it's out there and I haven't figured out what it is, or I haven't figured out how to code it. So think about something like corporate governance. We think corporate governance is really important, and we've created indexes of all the things we're important, which is an index of 1 to 10 of 14 features. And then we stick into regression, and it works sometimes and not others. And so I think the challenge is there is some information it is easy for me to put in a context, and I give it to you, and you give it to someone else, and after that game of telephone, they know everything. Tesla was up 4% today. You tell someone, they tell someone, we fully understand it. Petersen is honest. I think that's much harder to sort of capture in a way that is durable and transmittable, because your definition of honesty may be different than mine. When you mean honest, like what behaviors are you talking about? Petersen does cross the street when the light is red. He doesn't always cross at the corners, but if I borrow money from you, I will honestly return it. Under what context? So when things are good, I tend to be honest when things are bad. Now, what I really like about your question is, notice the question was good, but the answer wasn't great. And I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I still don't have an awesome answer. I think it's an important distinction because if I look at all these different institutions and the way they've evolved, I see the fingerprints, and I see the reason we had bank consolidation is the way we made loans had to be you and me, and all the information was up here. We put a bunch of that stuff on paper, and all of a sudden, not only did you and I not have to be in the room, but you didn't need me anymore, like the decision makers. So we could automate it. It creates huge consolidation banking. It drops the cost. All of a sudden, we can make much smaller loans because of the transaction cost of doing it. We get much better geographic diversification. So far, everything's awesome. But then we don't think about those last two I have. So that's why I think it's useful. But I also think your question points out that don't think of it as this is soft and that's hard and it's two discrete boxes. And that's why I like the characteristics. Kind of the way I think about debt and equity. That sort of help keep going?
Well, I mean, for example, one of the examples of soft information you gave yourself was this situation where beauty matters or attractiveness matters, right? I mean, actually, that in the end turned out to be hard information because somebody wrote a paper about that and couldn't measure beauty, right?
Yeah, and see, that's the beauty. That some of this stuff, and there's where I think your missing definition is probably more accurate. It was information that was coded. Now, the way she did it is she had a bunch of people rate this, and that average rating worked. Apparently, she said, if you go back to biology and you look at the symmetry of the face and you have a computer do it, it's not perfect, but it's highly correlated. So humans view beauty as symmetry. Well, then, by definition, it's hard information, and it would be something that I would have X years ago called soft, but you would have said, no, it's missing, it can be hardened. And that's why I think of that example of CRISP and that example of the credit rating. There's stuff that historically we've classified as soft that over time has become hard. And I think that process is getting faster and faster as the wealth of data goes up. But then it gets back to the context, how much of it is truly captured. So in the case of beauty, it is literally that picture coded into numbers. Once I do that, that does feel very hard. The description, if I go through those things, there must have been something there that the humans were encoding. Can you figure out what that is and therefore let a computer solve that problem? If the answer is yes, then my guess is it doesn't work. So this feels a little bit like quant trading, right? If you can systematize it, and so other people systematize it, doesn't work. In the asset pricing literature, we seem to know that. In the lending literature in fintech, I don't think we fully appreciate that yet. Awesome question.
Other questions? So maybe you can think.
Right. So I guess I'm going to ask as beginning you said something, ask the simple question, what's the average return from, if I ask the question, what's the kind of number to describe a fraction of hard versus soft information in the financial market, say, in the history and going forward? What kind of number we are looking at, or what's the trend we are looking at?
So the closest I can think of two examples where we tried to do it, neither of which I'm fully satisfied with. So I think Jensen has a paper explaining the prices of orange juice. And he puts in all the weather data you possibly can think of, not just the average temperature in Florida, but really localized, and the R-squared is really small. The other one is credit reporting. So like in some of this early literature, the way they looked at hard versus soft is they said, let's run a regression of the interest rate on all the things in the credit file. Well, some of this is missing information because you knew that although I haven't defaulted in the last 7 years, I actually did default when I was out of high school. And some of it was information. So I don't know the answer, but I sort of think of an R-squared. The problem with the Jensen example, or the problem with all of our asset pricing models, is how much of it is factors we don't have, how much of it is sort of market microstructure effects, how much of it is the emotions that in theory we could practice but not know for sure. So that's the way I'd think about it. At least in the two examples I've had, the hard information, the R-squared numbers are really, really small.
But you also meant there's a hardening of soft information.
And all this work on text processing, I think, is exactly that. So what are the regressions we run? Everything on the right side came from the income statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flow. And then we added the footnotes. And then we added sort of text processing. And then now there are people that are doing the voice tone of the earnings announcements. And so again, we are numericizing a lot of data that wasn't numerical before. Is that hard versus soft? I can create a corporate governance index from 1 to 10. So the fact I can create an index, I don't think necessarily means that. And the way I think about that is, when you look at a 5, do you know what a 5 means? Well, then you have to go read all the underlying ones, but even when you do that, you don't feel like it's fully captured. In fact, there's some firms that you think are poorly managed that have a 7, and there's some that are much better managed of a 3. So I made a numeric index. I quote hard in the information, but I don't really think it captured it in the sense the context of the collector isn't there in those numbers.
Björn, and then Andrew.
Thanks for a great lecture. One of the things that I when I first read your paper was about the hardening of information. That it always means that we throw out some of the soft information to turn into hard information. And now we see big data and machine learning and artificial intelligence all over the place. So we should clearly be concerned about how much information these processes are throwing out. But then, on the other hand, you could argue maybe that the big data is so big that it's, we could never digest all of it without these techniques. So then maybe we should be optimistic. Are you more concerned than optimistic about that?
I wouldn't say concerned as much as cynical. So, you know, the statement now coming out of the mouth of the empirists, you're going to find shocking. I think big data has made me have an even greater appreciation for theory. So if you think about what we do, bad empirical work is machine learning. We go run a regression and X is correlated with Y. What theory does is tell me why X causes Y, and why it causes Y plus in this case and Y minus in this case, where I can go back. So go back to your early machine learning. One of the early factoids they found in the marketing literature is if you look at sales at convenience stores between midnight and 6 a.m., if someone buys diapers, the next most common thing they buy is beer. Right? And once you say it, it makes total sense, right? Now, what do you do with that? That's a fact that has no value. Well, you put the beer next to the diapers. No, I guarantee Dad is there at 2 in the morning for diapers. He will find the beer no matter where it is. And so the two pieces are, I'm optimistic in the sense it lets us find a lot of misinformation. It takes the other 180 pages we haven't been able to use and now opens up this huge gold mine. This is why I think, you know, the junior faculty have this advantage. It's so exciting because there's so much cool data. What I worry about when the data scientists take over opposed to the economists is we lose the theory. So what I'd still like to see is, why are you looking at the correlation between X and Y? And if it's really true, what is going on, and therefore what is the next and the next and the next correlation? I also dislike black boxes because I don't understand them. I don't like a corporate governance index that I don't understand. I like simple OLS regressions because I kind of know what's going on. And if you've seen any of my talks, you also see I do a huge amount of pictures. I like pictures opposed to tables. That's going to be the third problem with it. It's going to be the communication. So you run this through and you say, I have a model that predicts default at 98% probability opposed to 90%. We should use this. Why is it better? And it's such a black box, I can't decipher it. And that's the part I worry. And this is the part where I think economics has a lot.
Okay, so let's have Andrew.
Yes, my question is related to both your questions earlier. So basically, yeah, so with the, all the hardening of soft information brought on by technology, I'm actually not sure if that actually has increased the precision of our forecasting models, right? You know, because just as you said, you know, there's a lot of, for those of us who work in this field, we know that a lot of these techniques to harden this information is more art than science. Right? It's pretty subjective. There's a lot of discretion involved. So, you know, do you think these are, in terms of value, are they really going to, going forward, do we have more confidence this will increase the precision of the models, or that's going to bring up more spurious correlations?
Yes. I mean, I think it's got to be both, right? And the fact you connect to the previous one, I think is exactly right. So if I have more data, can I predict the returns over the next quarter better? Well, once these sales and earnings come out, that comes out. With data, if I can predict that 4 days earlier, is that valuable? On a private basis, if I trade, yes. On an allocation of real assets, I got to believe not at all. Spurious correlation, yes. And especially if there's not the grounding of theory, because the more data I have and the more precise it is and the more black boxy, fancy words no one's going to question. So bringing this back to simple, like, tell me what's going on, I find is a very devastating question when they want to go into impact investing or fintech or whatever, and you literally ask. And you start to see that there's someone that's very good with data and also understand the intuition, i.e. a well-trained Ph.D., or someone that just found the correlation. Everything I showed you about manipulating models, I think you just said this could be on steroids, and I think you're right.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.